why you came all the way up here.
There's nothing left.
Welcome to your weekly ticket. John Krasinski's A Quiet Place Part 2 just became the biggest pandemic-era box office hit. The Paramount film made $57 million over the Memorial Day weekend, which is roughly what the film was projected to make prior to the pandemic when it was originally set to be released in March of 2020. Aaron Taylor Johnson has signed on to star in another Marvel movie, this time playing Kraven the Hunter. This will be a part of the Sony Cinematic Universe and not the MCU, where last Taylor Johnson played the character Quicksilver in Avengers Age of Ultron. Kraven is one of Marvel's most iconic anti-heroes who has encountered Venom and Black Panther among many others, and is one of Spider-Man's most known enemies. The film will be a solo movie about Kraven, and Sony Pictures has scheduled the film to be released on January 13th, 2023. Warner Brothers has set a remake for The Hunger, the 1983 vampire film that was directed by Top Gun director Tony Scott. The remake is all set to be directed by Angela Robinson with a script written by Jessica Sharzer. The original Tony Scott film was based on Whitley Strieber's novel of the same name, and it starred Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie, and Susan Sarandon. In honor of Pride Month and Rotten Tomatoes' list of 30 essential LGBTQ horror films, we're taking a deep dive into all things queer horror. And to help us break it all down, I'm joined by the screenwriter of Freaky, Michael Kennedy. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is a pleasure.
Now, I want to know, what is unique about queer horror?
I think queer horror is one of the last subgenres of horror, if not the last subgenre of horror, that is still completely transgressive. In a lot of ways, one of the last places where you can be completely daring, because just living as a queer person, you're automatically put in a political box by a lot of people. So I think a lot of filmmakers that play in the queer space use that to their advantage. And I think it's one of the last places in film, really, and especially in the horror genre, where you can do that and kind of go for it in a lot of ways without having to worry about what the studio thinks or, placating to a separate audience. I think it's just an awesome genre, and I think it's on the rise right now too. I think we're hitting a time where we're starting to see a little bit more of it, and you're starting to hear a little bit less of the studios going, "We already have our queer horror movie." Because that's something I used to hear in the past.
Oh,
and it's like, well, you can do too, but you're hearing that less frequently. People are starting to play in this space a little more, which is great.
What is it about horror that lends itself to, speaking that sort of message, I guess?
I think it's, they go hand in hand, right? Horror back in the day, especially in the 70s and 80s, 60s even, like I said, was transgressive. It was a genre that was doing stuff that no other genres were doing, and they were addressing topics that no other genres were addressing. And I still think that's done today. So it just kind of goes hand in hand with queerness, right? Like, it's kind of being a rebel, even though you may not be choosing to be a rebel, but you're almost, like I said, by being born, you're kind of making you're considered a statement to some people. And I think for me, especially personally, and I think for a lot of queer folks too, when we didn't have movies of our own to kind of grasp onto or call our own, like explicitly queer, we were able to find anything in a queer horror movie that spoke to us. I think you could literally take every horror movie ever made, and a queer person can put a queer read on it in some way or another.
Oh, okay.
Whether it's the story or the filmmaker or a character. I know for me personally, I really, really identify with the Sidney Prescotts and the Laurie Strodes and the quote unquote final girl, because to me, that was the closest in the 90s growing up as a 90s teen, the closest we had to a queer character, where they were our avatars. So I think that's the beauty of horror and the beauty of queerness, is you can find your space in something that's not explicitly gay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
That's why horror is awesome, because you can do it with horror more than you can do it with any other genre.
There's a lot of freedom in horror.
There is, yeah.
Yeah. All right, getting back to the list of 30 essential LGBTQ horror films, which movies from that list would you recommend?
If people are going to go and look at the list, they should watch all 30. Like those are all essential horror movies, queer horror movies especially.
You got all of Pride Month. That's what, like one a day?
Watch one a day. I'm telling you. When I was scrolling through the list, I was literally like, I would recommend every single one of these movies. But I will shout out a specific few. Night Warning I want to recommend because it's just so weird and it's so crazy. It came out during like the height of the 80s slasher movie when like I think a slasher was being released in theaters like every week. And it's so weird and it's so campy. And the story between the main character and his aunt is just so bizarre that it's like one of the queerest things you'll ever see. And it's super fun. The lead character is really, really interesting to watch. The woman that plays his aunt is wild. So if you're looking for like camp, like high camp, watch that. The classics like Dracula's Daughter, Seed of Chucky, those kind of movies I recommend just for the pure fact that those are historic films that you need to include in your queer viewing canon. Jennifer's Body, I think that's starting to finally hit the mainstream about 10 years later.
That's crazy. It's really having a comeback, isn't it?
Way ahead of its time. And to me, it's probably the best horror movie of the 2000s. It's amazing. So amazingly gay, so amazingly feminist. And Megan Fox has never been better. If society could go back and do a redo, that would be the movie where we recalibrate our feelings towards Megan Fox and Diablo Cody and Amanda Seyfried, because it's like the perfect movie. It just came out at the wrong time. And the studio messed up. They marketed it for like teen bros, So like had they shown their cards a little bit, I think it would have hit the mark then. But I love that it's having a huge resurgence now because it plays even better now than it did 12 years ago. Another camp classic that people need to see. You have to see this movie and tell me if you've seen it or not. Is Hello, Mary Lou, Prom Night 2?
I haven't.
It's wild. It's so wild. It is so gay. And it's also a total reaction to Freddy Krueger. Because the original Prom Night is a slasher starring Jamie Lee Curtis. And then the sequel is just a sequel in name only. It's just called Prom Night 2. And I don't want to spoil it because it's so wild, but it's got like a Freddy Krueger type villain instead, where like the prom queen of the 50s dies and her spirit ends up in a girl in the 80s. So she's like going around killing a bunch of her classmates, but she does it in Freddy Krueger's, not in dreamscape, but she does it in very fantastical ways like Freddy. And it's awesome.
I love it. Awesome. I love it. I'll have to check.
So those are my big recommendations, but I have to say, watch all 30 of them.
Watch all 30. All right. Are you looking forward to any queer horror films that are on the horizon? Besides Freaky 2?
God willing. I mean, my next movie is pretty queer. That's about to start shooting. It's called Time Cut, but it's pretty queer like Freaky. So I'm looking forward to that.
You gotta. All right. I want to talk about the Babadook and how the Babadook has become an unlikely LGBTQ icon in recent years. Hopefully you can explain that to everyone and then also tell us what other film deserves that treatment.
Kind of like the urban legend of the Babadook, and like kind of what I think happened is that movie just ended up on the Netflix queue one day in queer horror during Pride, I think a couple of years ago. So people saw that and it became a meme during Pride about the Babadook being like a queer character. And so then people were memifying it within Pride parameters and like rainbows and just all these queer different things. They were slotting it in really clever ways into already existing queer memes and that kind of stuff. So it's almost like one of those situations where it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like it almost was like an accident, because there is like an urban legend too that, the people that like curate the things on like Netflix and stuff, they accidentally did it, but it ended up spawning a life of its own. So it's like one of those instances where like, is it the chicken or the egg? Did the meme like create the queerness of the Babadook, or did the Babadook create the queerness? You know what I mean?
Yep. Love it either way.
But when you go back and watch the movie, it's another example of what the beauty of horror, where when you start thinking of it in that lens, you start seeing a lot of the inherent queerness in the film, especially with the single mom and probably her gay little boy. Like the character's like 6, so he's not sexualized in any way. But you watch the movie, and I know for me, I was like, oh, I was a little bit like this when I was 6. That kid's gay. You know what I mean? So like it's kind of taken a life of its own, but now it's like really embraced. And a lot of that movie has to deal with grief too, which I think for a lot of queer people is inherent in our lives. Just with, coming out, I don't know, like for me, I definitely had like a grieving process with my life in a lot of ways, because you're playing pretend for a lot. So like I don't know, like there's grief involved weirdly with the process, at least there was for me. But yeah, so it kind of like it became its own thing. So now the Babadook is like, people love the Babadook. They love a queer icon.
What like icon or horror movie do you think deserves that treatment? That deserves to get, I guess, looked at again?
Do you know which one I really wish people would embrace, honestly?
What's that?
Is Nightmare on Elm Street 3. If you know the history of that franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is actually considered by a lot of people to be one of the gayest movies ever made. There's a whole thing with that. If you, after the show, I'm telling you, go Google that and you'll fall in a rabbit hole of just the history of that film. He wasn't openly queer during the making of the movie, but he was on set. And then the movie kind of like f***ed his career. So there's like a whole history of that. There's now a documentary about that movie. There's a lot of controversy with that film too, because the writer and director of that movie kind of don't like, depends on what year you see an interview with them. In 1 minute, they're like, we love that it's a queer horror movie. And then the next, they're like, we resent that it's considered queer. So I bring this all up because Nightmare on Elm Street 3, to me, is actually the queer nightmare movie. And it's a beautiful representation of queerness. So I want to see that movie wholly embrace the way Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is, not only by the horror fans of it, but also like the general film public. Nightmare 3 is about a bunch of kids and shipped off to a mental hospital by their parents. They do group therapy, which is clearly disguised as conversion therapy. And the 7 kids band together to essentially take down not only Freddy, but essentially their parents and society that forced them to go do something they didn't want to do. So it has a really awesome story and it has a really amazing, like positive queer representation, where I think the queer representation in Nightmare 2 is negative.
All right, well, there you go. Get it done, audience. We need the viewers to get this done. All right, Michael, where can, besides the big screen, where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram. It's at Michael TJ Kennedy. And you will see lots of pictures of my dog.
Oh, well, that's great. All right, well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. It was fun.
In theaters this weekend, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and Spirit Untamed.
Hey. You okay there? Jesus. I think I hurt someone.
The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is the 7th film in the Conjuring universe and reveals a chilling story of terror, murder, and unknown evil that shocked even experienced real-life paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. One of the most sensational cases from their files, it starts with a fight for the soul of a young boy, then takes them beyond anything they'd ever seen before to mark the first time in US history that a murder suspect would claim demonic possession as a defense. And available to watch on Vudu this week is Spiral and Profile.
Do you know where your officers are?
Working in the shadow of his father, an esteemed police veteran played by Samuel L. Jackson, brash detective Ezekiel Zeke Banks played by Chris Rock, and his rookie partner take charge of an investigation into murders that are eerily reminiscent of the city's gruesome past. All right, well, that's it for this week, but before you go, leave a comment and let us know what you'll be watching this week. I'm Khail, and I'll see you next time.